So we'll be moving on to the session three. So it's going to be a flow. It's going to be on flow-based development, adventure of the 5G development team by Ravi Tadwalker.
All right, guys. I'm probably the most uh, youthful and continuous learning person here. I mean, uh, youthful for sure. Maybe, perhaps, too much to say about continuous learning. I think everybody's been talking about mindset. So I thought maybe I'll talk about values and flow. So, little diversion, huh? But I thought of relating the two. The theme of our event is really about mindset. So, when I talk about flow of product development in the context of a case study of a team, I'm actually talking in terms of how the team looked at leadership mandates, looked at status quo situation evolving, looked at compliance activities happening around them, and decided to do something different radically. Like, you know how Naxalites do, or people with passion do, people in trenches, stealth mode, startups do, right? So, this is a story of one such team, uh, which was actually dealing with all these anti patterns. We saw some anti-patterns in Rama's presentation just now. I'm not sure if cognitive bias was one of them. Uh, uh, Corporations have cognitive biases sometimes, and they are part of the value system of the leadership. Whoever is at the top of the helm tends to have that drive. And lately, you see that one such cognitive bias is let's iterate. That's because iterative development is the only way to produce any feature set out of any team. And I would say about 90% of that is true, but there is 10% uh, there that it doesn't apply to all kinds of teams, and definitely not non-development teams and teams that don't really do software development and such. Uh, so, looking at the history of this particular engagement in last quarter of 2019, uh, I was actually thinking of rebooting 2019, let alone 2020, that the virus thing is making me think of. But anyway, jokes apart, the situation was actually very grim. The leadership mandate was that everybody will do Scrum, and their specific scrumming method was a 3 week sprint based cadence. And they were actually doing more like a fast waterfall. So they used to have first week of development, second week of testing, and third week of release QA, which means leave everything in the current sprint and only focus on the release integration activities. So what used to typically happen is a story taken in the first week of current sprint would actually be tested in the second week of the next sprint and would be deployed in the third week of the third sprint. So typical cycle time was anywhere from 8 to 9 weeks. So they were of course having this situation of going 3 steps forward and coming back 2 steps. So what does that do to the flow? We know there's no flow in a situation like this. So when you look at vanity metrics and wikis devoted to compliance and in the name of documentation and whatever kind of compliance requirements there could be, the real developer who is looking for passion, to be proud of the, the craft and to be proud of the the result on a deployed server, that doesn't necessarily happen. Which developer in the first year of apprenticeship or the 25th year of experience level would like to see his or her story deployed in the ninth week? You tell me, guys. You wouldn't, certainly, right? So we looked at it seriously, 3 people team from industrial logic, and we thought that we should actually look at some of the patterns. We observed few teams and we came to conclusion independently that we definitely need to start inside out here, because the top-down mandates, one size fits all, is not really a good thing at a team level. I mean, you cannot have all teams do one particular type of process. We have to realize that processes are meant to provide a runway to produce an outcome or set of outcomes that will get some marketplace for the company, for the product and services. And if that's not really happening, then that process is completely waste of time, at least from the engineering and release management perspective, if not business. Business would actually care less about what process you use. They would be more concerned about market share and and those kind of factors. And so, how do you move such a ship which is so much compliance oriented that they're not really producing, they're just compliant? And business would see it, and business would say, okay, we have cash cow products, we are doing pretty well with this 3 week waterfall style of scrumming. So why change? I mean, we're getting what we want, a little bit late, of course, yeah, but the customers are not really complaining. So there's no really any impetus for change here. Now, as a consultant coming in to an engagement like this, what would you do? How would you motivate engineers that are actually seeing something different? What would you do? We thought, therefore, of looking at it from the bottoms up, and we thought maybe we introduce some practices that will create collaboration, reduce the silos, and go evolutionary rather than disruptive. Because if you try to introduce something disruptive in a world of status quo, people don't always take it positively. Uh, and so doing something in an evolutionary method, starting from where you are, like the Kanban method suggests, is a good stance many times in a place like this. So moving from a fixed mindset to showcase, there's a typo here. This should have been growth mindset. But in any case, you got my point here that moving from a compliance-oriented fixed mindset to showcase a learning, continuous learning mindset or growth mindset was the point here. So there were some challenges in their current environment, and I think I alluded to a few of them. Long sprint cycles, more than 2 weeks, with mini waterfall, and then there were some teams which tried 1 week sprints, and they realized that it was just becoming very difficult with distributed team members in multiple countries and coasts and such. Uh, and then the other thing was this something called unplanned work bucket. That even if the the engineering management was telling everybody to leave capacity, 20% capacity for unplanned work, that 20% is a is a misnomer. You probably know that if you have been an engineer. The 20% of what is a big question there. I mean, it's very easy in the Scrum world to say that there are X number of hours by subtracting number of hours spent in ceremonies and such. I mean, it can be quantitative to the hell, to the death, I would say. But regardless, it's for the true engineer in trenches, the unplanned work is something that he or she hates, and it's the job of leadership to actually enable the team to be focused on the goals of the feature set, and just see if you can get rid of unplanned work or do something with it. But that's not always possible. And I mean, there are several possibilities there. This team tried something So this team in particular tried to have a Kanban board in the world famous tool called Jira. And then they tried to have their unplanned work tracked that way while they were sprinting in the 3 week mode, just like any other team within the group. And this was actually IoT group of a well-known networking company here. Um, in any case, the team realized that having two boards, one Scrum board for feature development and another Kanban board for unplanned work, wasn't really working because they had to look at two different boards in parallel, and it just didn't really help them deal with the problem at hand. And the problem was really about having flow, efficient flow. So they came to the three of us, and we said we can introduce some engineering practices that will help you produce faster flow of work, reduce the red tape of software development processes that you have. So, for example, laborious code review and walkthrough cycles. You probably know this, that the more matured an organization is, the more matured code review process is. And so, uh, not always welcome, right? To suggest ideas like that. Sometimes, what I meant is, sometimes you cannot really go to an organization and say and tell the director of engineering or VP of engineering that your processes are all screwed up, and this is what I recommend. This is another thing I recommend. You cannot always do that to leadership, but what you can try is you can take a team or a team lead and a QA lead and then talk to them about the pluses and minuses of changing to a nimbler, leaner process and see if that works. Do some pilots. So that was our approach here. We thought of piloting with the team that was doing the most advanced technologically advanced work within the IoT space within this particular group. And so switching to a more lean process than Scrum process was of course something that we thought of. The question is, how do you introduce something like a Scrumban process or a Kanban process for feature development when there is a senior leadership level mandate that thou shall do Scrum? Things are not always easy. So we suggested that we will do something more like a iteration-based Kanban, or the creator of Scrumban, Corey Ladas, calls this as level 2 Scrumban. If you have read his book on Scrumban, you probably know what I'm talking about. So they thought about it in terms of matching the cadence, the third week release testing cadence and such. But they quickly realized that that will still not solve the problem of the third week focus being somewhere else, and that will just not really give you the faster flow. In other words, if you introduce Kanban with iterations, you would still run into this problem of first week story getting deployed in maybe not 8th week, but maybe 5th week. So they really wanted to do things more like a one piece or with as much efficiency as possible. So they actually got rid of boundaries, meaning they just didn't want to have iteration at all. So with the Scrum boundary gone and a linear process like Scrumban, let's see what and how they got to the nirvana state of efficient flow. So we thought about creating champions within this group, and one way to create champions is to to introduce them to gamification. And in the world of Lean and Kanban in general, there are plenty of games that you can actually use to teach principles and concepts. And one such game, a popular game that many of us trainers have, is Get Kanban. Here you see me actually setting up a board game, Get Kanban board game, to showcase various types of activities that you do in terms of creating flow of work. And what you would see, probably those who have tried this game or played this game already know that it's very interactive, and the teams actually come up with ideas to improve or improvise their processes to create faster flows. And they actually come up with improved value streams out of their existing software processes. So one constraint, one artificial, well, not really artificial, one real constraint that the team had to deal with was this thing called third week release integration cadence, right? So I suggested that don't really work around that. Just understand that you're elevating that constraint. The people here may have heard about theory of constraint. I'm talking about elevating a constraint. By that I mean that you're actually making the organization explicitly see that constraint in form of a queue on a Kanban board like this. So over here, this ready to release is that queue where integration tests are run on the state server. So that's the queue. This is the kind of queue which was bottlenecking in their context. This doesn't mean that they did not have CI or anything. They had CI, they had Jenkins and modern stacks and what have you. I mean, this was in a sense legacy code base, Java JSP based code base, but they had CI server running. They had continuous integration, not necessarily continuous delivery. They didn't want that, but at least running CI server doesn't really mean that you have dealt with the problem of system integration. To be honest with you guys, in really complex world, that doesn't happen. So you have to work around, build empathy with the system, and then see what you can do to improve it. So that's why I always say that you have to look at current value stream and start there. That's the point about starting where you are. This way, you are not really disrupting this ecosystem when you are introducing change. So it's more like a bit by bit evolutionary way of introducing change. So after playing the Get Kanban game with me and few other coaches, they realized that they wanted to have expedite swim lane, they wanted to have intangible swim lane, and these two took care of the unplanned work explicitly in terms of visualizing the unplanned work, right? And then they actually created swim lanes for their releases, and that was pretty nice. They actually, during the game-based training and learning, they came up with this value stream, which was based on their existing software development process. So you could see that they already had elevated their constraint in terms of release integration week 3. Now, of course, in reality, they wanted to have continuous flow in that if the story was over here in ready state, got into dev, got into the QA environment, got into staging, then got into deployment, then got into running. They wanted to have this as fast as possible. They did not want to have the typical 8 to 9 weeks cycle time. That's in fact the reason they switched to a flow-based system with us helping them. They started managing that flow efficiency with better collaboration. Many times you would see that when you have Scrum teams out of existing organization, Dr. Badri mentioned about Conway's laws, right? Where if the org structure is actually replica of your systems architecture and the systems design, what Conway's law says, then the trouble with that approach is that the team's silos become stronger and stronger actually. So it becomes very hard to collaborate, even though the teams are iterating and such. Doesn't mean that their inter-team collaboration has actually improved. Uh, so by looking at patterns of flow of work in the cumulative flow diagram, whether there are fat bellies or whether there are just stagnant seas, that nothing is happening during this time, for example, here in this state, they could actually communicate to either the upstream teams or downstream teams about the changes or about their needs for that matter. In a sense, you can see that cumulative flow of work exposes the bottlenecks that develop. So, for example, when there is a fat belly between these two dates, this date and this date here, this particular fat belly I'm talking about, it is an indicator of pile of work coming up here, for example, or this particular queue in the Kanban system is basically slowing the rest of the queues down. In a sense, that's really what it means. And likewise, when you look at control chart, when this deviation is way too much like this, it's an indicator of unstable system. In other words, it indicates that the predictability is actually gone for a toss. So flow of work can become efficient and predictable if the standard deviation is smaller and smaller. And that's really what you want in a good control chart, for example. Likewise, in a cumulative flow diagram, you would want to have lines that are almost parallel to each other, and in a way, there's no fat belly around, between queues. So those are the things to watch out whether the flows are efficient, flow of work is efficient or not. And they were doing this. They started doing this very, very much consistently. And look, if you see this is their value stream with that red thing being the elevated constraint. And you can probably see that in terms of the time series here, around this time, the constraint really became not really a constraint, which means they actually worked on that constraint with the leadership team for that long to minimize the impact of that constraint on that team as well as other teams. The other thing we introduced to increase the flow of work, or in fact to improve the flow of work, was things like mobbing. So you can see these two engineers, they're actually the peer coaches of mine in this particular engagement. They were showing a pair programming session. What they're doing is they're looking at a Python test script which had a test case scenario written in a custom domain-specific language that they had come up with, DSL syntax that they had come up with. And these coaches were trying to teach them the Gherkin syntax. The people here, if they are familiar with behavior-driven development, probably understand what I'm talking about. But in a sense, we were trying to introduce them to the modern trends and the new ways of working in terms of these engineering practices where you could introduce. So for example, the test automation team was very excited when they saw this toolkit, so to say. And likewise, the product managers that were finding the silos of product management team sitting in another building and the engineering and release management sitting in yet another building and the silos widening thereby, they were trying to actually do things like business canvas and business model canvas and such. But I suggested that instead of trying to do something lofty like that, let's start with story mapping. So we looked at some context, and they provided a context of a demo that they were preparing for December launch to showcase their capabilities. And we created a user story map. And I remember still that on that particular day, the Scrum Master, she had brought her dog with her that day. And we asked her what was the name of the dog. And so our persona here is actually that dog, just to make them excited about this thing. Um, like the story map as simple as possible. Um, and this is something that they liked actually, because not only the Scrum Master and the product owner liked the idea of visualizing the requirements this way, but also the testers, because they were not used to looking at test requirements or, for that matter, use case or user story requirements in a visual way like this. So by making requirements visual and then executable was something that we achieved with this team. And that these two things created faster flow. Yes.
We are we are running out of time. Is it possible if we can take up the Q&A now? One question.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Sure. Thank you. So we have one question from Jitendra Vedi. How to project agility benefits through tangible metrics like business value?
Good question. How to project metrics to prove that there's a value. I think the Scrum people will say that showing burn-up charts and stuff like that will show that people are actually producing epic work here and work is burning up. Now, in the world of Kanban, we look at it a little differently. In the world of Kanban, we look at flow of work, and we actually only look at one metric here, which is cycle time. Is the cycle time to develop a feature reducing or not? So if the cycle time to produce a feature is reducing, that means the business value is reaching faster. You're getting feedback, you're dealing with course corrections and such. So essentially, and I can give an example of this. When we were dealing with product innovation and agility at eBay back in 2017, 2018, we were asked to come up with only one metric company-wide to deal with business agility. And we suggested that shall be cycle time. So we killed all the Scrum metrics and we said, if there is anything that matters really, it's the cycle time. Are we really improving our cycle times by showcasing the features or product fixes or bug fixes or in terms of creating that value, business value generation? Is it becoming faster and faster? Does that answer your question?
I believe yes. Okay. So thank you for having your session today, and I believe participants have got the right insights which they can utilize as part of their work. It was great having you for the event, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.